Hi, everybody. Nice to be with you. I just want to take a moment to recognise how extraordinary the work is that Leona has been doing for the last few years. It can feel very, very much when you're having conversations about mental health and journalism, you can feel very alone. And often, Leona and I have connected on Twitter, and we've often felt like we were kind of lone voices in some ways shouting about this. It's absolutely extraordinary what she's achieved. It was really great to meet her finally after 3 years of conversing via Twitter. So I'm very, very honoured to be here, Leona. Thank you ever so much for inviting me. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about my story, about my journey, about my experience of mental health, how that led me to set up Headlines Network. We're going to have a bit of a conversation, an interactive conversation around some of the kind of challenges perhaps that we're hearing and facing in newsrooms. I'm going to share with you a little bit about what I've heard, speaking with dozens of journalists from around the world. I'm currently writing a book for Routledge, a practical guide to journalism and mental health, for which I've interviewed dozens of people. So I'll give you a little bit of a kind of sharing of what I've heard, and then hopefully we can talk about what works to support us, and also take on board some next steps. I'd like to try, if possible, something slightly interactive. Hopefully most of you have got smartphones. I would like to invite you to scan that QR code, please, just so I can get a sense of how people in the room are. And then you should be able to there should be some multiple choice questions. If you would like, it's completely anonymous. If you would like to let me know how you're feeling today, then hopefully I can get a sense of, can you all see the multiple choice questions on there? Yeah. It should come up, but given that my Chief Technical Officer, John Crowley, who's part of Headlines as well, is not here today. There we go, James, thank you. Lovely, thank you. Okay, so we've got upbeat, yay. Chilled, yay. Exhausted, not so yay. Okay, great. Good to see nobody's hungover, excellent. Nobody's flat, nobody's broken, which is brilliant. And nobody is something else. Can be something else if you want. It's changing a little bit. We're hovering around the top, so upbeat. Brilliant to see that almost half of the room is upbeat, and that almost a quarter of the room is okay. So thank you. That is completely anonymous. You'll be using that QR code a little bit later on, and you'll be going to the Q&A section of there, where I would like to invite you to answer a couple of questions. Often it can be really difficult to speak about our mental health. So often using anonymous tools can be helpful as well. I'd like to help normalise conversations, but I do recognise that not everybody feels comfortable speaking about their mental health as well. So thanks, folks, for joining with me on that, and I'm glad that most of you are feeling okay, upbeat, etc. You can see I'm walking around quite a lot. Hopefully you can hear me still if I move about, but I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about me, which sounds very kind of, pompous perhaps, but I think that it's really helpful to sometimes share stories to help create a space where people feel more able to speak about their own experiences. So as I said, my name's Hannah Storm. I've been a journalist for nearly 25 years. In that time, I've lived and worked and travelled in about 60 different countries around the world. And I've worked for radio, TV, and other forms of news. I'm just going to pause a moment. We heard before from Leona about how we suppress feelings in newsrooms and how often we're kind of, we're numb to things. One of the things I've learned in my experience as a journalist is to recognise how I feel about things. And I can already feel my hands getting a bit clammy and my heart's getting a little bit faster. And that moment in your throat where you're like, oh, I need to swallow a bit more frequently. That's because I'm about to tell you about some of my experiences. So in the course of my journalism career, I've worked for some absolutely extraordinary news organisations, some of the best news organisations in the world, supposedly some of the best news organisations in the world. I've also worked for news organisations that are very influential, that did not have my back at all, even though they should have done. In the course of being a journalist, I've experienced significant trauma. I've covered stories including the earthquake in Haiti. I've been raped in my work by somebody who I trusted as a source. I've been sexually assaulted several times as well. I've seen huge amounts of other traumas, and I've experienced vicarious trauma and moral injury. Two areas I'll bring into, two areas I'll talk about in a little while. You can hear me kind of like staggering a bit over my use of language. I developed post-traumatic stress disorder back in about probably 2017. It wasn't diagnosed until late 2019. By that point, I was on the road to recovery, but at my worst, I was suicidal. I drank too much alcohol. We heard from Leona, people reach for alcohol. I was horrible at home. I couldn't sleep. I had nightmares. I avoided certain things. I still avoid certain things that make me feel slightly uncomfortable. That's not because I've got PTSD, although I think that recovery is... Leona and I had dinner last night and we were talking about this idea that recovery is non-linear. You don't kind of like have PTSD and then you get better, you get better and everything's great. You'll have moments where it kind of goes a little bit like that. And yes, you are recovered from PTSD, but you can still have shitty days. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that we do have shitty days as well. So back in 2010, after the Haiti earthquake, I moved to an organisation called the International News Safety Institute, which works with news organisations around the world to support journalists going into some of the worst places in the world physically. War zones, environmental disasters, civil unrest, protests. I worked at INSEE for 9 years, and during that time, we were really kind of, working with newsrooms when journalists were kidnapped in Libya and in Syria. We were working with newsrooms when people were assaulted in places. We were working with newsrooms when people were going into some of the darkest places where humanity does some of the worst things to other human beings. That led me to experience a degree of what we call vicarious trauma. So vicarious trauma is secondary trauma. So it's experiencing trauma that's not necessarily our trauma, but it's trauma secondarily or vicariously. I experienced a lot of that, and a lot of that was cumulative. So, for instance, I heard weekly about journalists dying. I watched things during the Arab uprisings on social media that were deeply, deeply unpleasant. That built up cumulatively, as did my experiences of PTSD as well. Fast forward to 2019, as I say, when I sought help, it took me a long, long time to seek help. I was running a news organisation, INSEE, that was very, very male dominated. Yes, I was a woman running this news organisation, but as Leona said before, if newsrooms are macho, imagine media safety. It's like double macho, right? If you're talking about safety and it's a lot of guys with thick necks who are ex-military, and you've got a lot of news people speaking in there as well. So it's kind of like, don't honestly admit vulnerability, Hannah, otherwise you're completely screwed. Your career is down the toilet. It took me a long time to recognise that actually an admission of vulnerability is not an admission of failure. It's not an admission that you're shit at your job. It's an admission that actually you have that language and that strength to go, you know what? Yeah, that was hard. Yes, I've been injured by my work. Yes, I've been impacted by my work. And I'm going to use that to try to make a difference, to try to support others, to try to recognise that there is stigma, that there are taboos in place and barriers in place that prevent other people from speaking. I'm very fortunate. I'm a straight, white, university-educated, middle-class woman from England. That means that gives me a degree of privilege and platform that many people do not have. I know that those in our media industry who don't look like me and sound like me, who are more marginalised than me, have it less easy than me. So I decided to use that to set up an organisation called Headlines Network. The idea behind Headlines Network was we wanted to normalise conversations around mental health in journalism. I set the organisation up and now I work with a guy called John Crowley, and together we run Headlines. The idea is, as I say, it's a community to normalise conversations. I recognise there are other folks out there doing amazing work. James, who's here, Leona, who's here. I can see Angelina in the back from the Dart Centre. It's brilliant that we're doing this, but together we're stronger. Together we really are stronger, and I think it's really important that we do that. Headlines, we have funding from the Google News Initiative, which is great. And with that, we've been able to build a bank of practical multimedia resources. We work with experts. I am not a clinician. I'm a mental health first aider. I'm a journalist of 25 years. We work with experts as well to bring their expertise, their clinical expertise, into that space. We've created some resources around vicarious trauma, as I mentioned before, supporting our colleagues, managing our own mental health, and covering traumatic breaking news stories. So I'm really interested by this idea that Leona mentions, and I hear this a lot, of this notion that as journalists, we kind of are like first responders. We rush towards things when people rush away, right? And there are things that we have to deal with that normal, in inverted commas, members of the public don't have to deal with. And therefore, there are things that we have to take on board to protect ourselves as well. We offer workshops at all career stages. It's really important that we're speaking about trauma and mental health and resilience and all of these words which are still kind of like covered with stigma and taboo at every stage of our careers, because everybody brings different backgrounds and areas of expertise and expectations to this conversation. I know that a lot of Gen Z people, for instance, perhaps they feel more comfortable speaking about their mental health. Perhaps their expectations are different because you're more familiar with the language, right? Whereas people who are my age, kind of mid-40s or so, we've been brought up in an industry that is just like, put up and shut up, Hannah. You know, put up and shut up. You know, I remember the first time I talked about my Me Too, in inverted commas, experiences, people were like, yeah, but like we all had to deal with that shit, didn't we? And actually, it's not good enough to say, yeah, but. It's really important that we speak about these things where we feel comfortable, but never feel forced to do so. Just in terms of the other career stages as well, we hear a lot of the time from managers. I call it the stress sandwich. So managers kind of have people who are more senior with them, perhaps kind of newsroom leaders, and then people who are reporting to them. And they're often caught in this stress sandwich in terms of, so how am I going to manage my own mental health? How can I support the folks who are working for me? And how am I going to be able to kind of hopefully influence those further up the food chain in the newsroom than me? So as I say, we offer workshops in all of those spaces. We have a podcast. I love my podcast because I'm an ex-radio journalist as well. And we get brilliant journalists, like really kind of celebrated human beings like Fergal Keane and Clive Myrie from the BBC and Alex Crawford from Sky, and a nod to James for helping set up that podcast. And we get them to talk about the stories they've covered and the stories that have impacted them and how journalism matters and why it matters. And back to that point that Leona makes, we are human beings. Journalists are human beings. So often when I'm speaking with folks around the world and I facilitate conversations, I hear them say, I don't want much. I just want my newsroom manager to say to me, thank you, or that must have been a tough job. To recognise that I'm a human being, not a part of a sausage factory. Yeah? And so we ask these folks who are pretty influential and well known to share their stories, because we know that storytelling, story sharing can help others. And we are all storytellers as journalists, okay? We all are conditioned to not have our own stories, to not share our own stories. And often it's not appropriate to share our stories in certain settings, right? But sometimes it is. And I think that we need to normalise those stories as well. So you're going to have if you can flick the QR, if you go onto the QR code, for some reason this is the wrong QR code because I'm not the Chief Technical Officer of my organisation, so apologies for that. But if you go onto that, you'll see a Q&A on there. I would like to invite you to share with me what you feel the biggest challenges to mental health are in your journalism work, please. And I'm just going to take a moment to give you the opportunity to do that. So if you go into the QA bit, and you can write down there what you feel are the biggest challenges. So it'll say Q&A and it'll say type your question. So actually type your answer if you don't mind. So it's anonymous again. I've got toxic newsrooms coming up. I've got tough mindset. Thank you for those who are adding these. Waiting for people to respond to interview requests. When to know when to speak up. Feeling safe to be authentic. Not knowing who to speak to if you're struggling. Culture in the newsroom, lots of mental health programs, but still a fundamental lack of understanding about what trauma is and how to help people process it. Not knowing when to say no to a dodgy story, even if you know yourself that it's dangerous/dodgy. Thank you everybody for sharing that. I'm going to invite you in a moment to, hopefully we can have a bit of a conversation to unpack some of that. Please note again that nobody should feel compelled to join in. And I've got a couple more. Lack of knowledge about trauma and how it affects people. That it's okay to ask for help. It's not a weakness. And getting the story at any cost, perhaps to the detriment of your own mental health. And I guess not getting enough support from middle management and other work colleagues. It's a lot of stuff there, right? Thank you. And a lot of you are nodding. And it's really great that you've taken the time to respond to that. I'm very, very grateful. These are all things that a lot of us are struggling with. These are all things that, go back 25 years, unfortunately, and I remember feeling very much the same way. So thank you again. I'm just going to see if anybody else has replied. So for instance, 2 very high-profile female journalists who have lost their lives recently. So Gary Lankesh in India and Daphne Caruana Galizia, who you might have heard of in Malta. Both of them were murdered. Both of them received threats of online violence against them before they were physically killed. So there's that close intersection between online violence and physical threats and violence as well. And specifically, as you say, there's this massive pressure. And let's not even we also haven't really mentioned that in many countries in the world, people are getting paid or not paid. So they're getting paid very small amounts of money, or they're doing their jobs, and there's this massive financial insecurity as well. So they're being forced to do this, often against the wishes of their family, to do this work, which is a kind of real mission-driven work. So it's really difficult. And, as you say, they're being forced into make these decisions around safety. The other thing we know about mental health is we make poorer decisions. When our mental health is compromised, we make poorer decisions. So we may take more strong risks or more severe risks when our mental health is compromised as well. So it's a really good point. Thank you. Does anybody else have anything else they want to mention before we move on? Feel free throughout. If you have any questions that you don't necessarily want to share in person, you're very welcome to use the QR code again. So this is kind of what I've learned from facilitating conversations in newsrooms, from writing this book that I'm doing, from speaking with folks around the world. A lot of this is pretty much mental health 101, but it's worth reinforcing again because, as we've seen, there are still taboos which are preventing people from coming and talking about it. Mental health needs to be a priority. It's not a priority. I would say probably for 90% of newsrooms around the world, including the biggest newsrooms, the most well-known newsrooms, the most well-resourced newsrooms, it's not a priority. It's not integrated and embedded throughout. It's a kind of bolt-on at the end. It's a afterthought. It's a, oh, by the way, we've got this EAP, Employee Assistance Program. It's always comes after, right? It needs to be a priority and it needs to be integrated throughout. It's got to be normalised through newsrooms. It should be as normal for me to say, I'm having a bad mental health day, or I'm really sorry that I can't deal with this right now because, as it is for me to say, I've got a migraine. Okay, it should be as normal as that. There are 2 things that come up when I'm speaking with people. One is this, as I mentioned, the kind of human beings. I want to be seen as a human being. And the second thing that comes up is people saying, I am too scared to admit that I am distressed, or my mental health is I have a mental health challenge or issue or condition or struggle, or however you want to phrase it, because I'm worried that I'm not going to get the next gig. I'm not going to get the next promotion. It's going to impact my career. It's going to impact my reputation. So those are the 2 things that time and time again, no matter where people are in the world, what their ethnicity, nationality, gender is, comes up. Investing in mental health saves money. Every single newsroom at the moment says they haven't got enough money, right? Which is funny, right? Because the amount of money they're spending perhaps on the coronation tomorrow would prove otherwise. But investing in mental health saves money. Deloitte, which is has done some research. It's not media specific, but actually, having spoken with a researcher who did this research, she says that actually it probably does work for media industry. Deloitte has done some research that says for every £1 invested in mental health proactively, there's a return of investment of £5.20. That's not rocket science. 5.2 times that. So that means for things like presenteeism is reduced. That means mental health sick days are reduced. That means that people stay in their jobs. We retain people more. We retain better, diverse people more. We don't have to go through recycling employment situations because people stay in the job. So for me, it's the £1 equals £5.20 return is one of the best arguments out there, right? But why are people still not doing that? I don't know. Mental health is the other side of the coin from physical health. When I had PTSD, I got really bad digestive problems. I got really bad back problems. I got really bad headaches. They're connected, but also it's just the flip side, right? You can't be physically well unless you're mentally well. You can't be mentally well unless you're physically well as well. So I think we need to be seeing that as two sides of the same coin as well. And I remember giving a speech about a month or so ago at the Society of Editors in London. And I was talking about mental health and I was talking about investment in mental health. And 3 or 4 people came up to me afterwards and said, "Thank you for your speech, it was great. It's really important that we talk about welfare and well-being." And I'm like, no, we're talking about mental health, okay? People are still worried about using this term mental health. For God's sake, we all have it. We all have mental health, like we all have physical health. We all experience it differently. Mental health doesn't mean that you're all messed up, that you're ill. We've all got mental health, right? And I think that once we kind of get over that fact, I think that's super important. Yet we all experience it differently based on our identity and our history and our biology and our so many different things, but we all experience it differently. And this is really important, as I've referenced already. Often those marginalised by our industry feel less able to speak about their experiences. And I think that, where that happens, it's closely linked. So mental health, I think, is closely linked to the diversity, equity and inclusion conversation. We have to invest in conversations to support those who feel most marginalised so we can retain those who feel most marginalised and support those who feel so to advance up the news industry. So we've got better leaders, and we've got leaders and journalists who represent better the societies that we serve. Specifically, so in the book I'm writing, I ask 4 different questions to people. And one of the questions I'm asking people is, what do you see as the main challenges at the moment facing mental health in journalism? And in the work I've been doing as well in the last couple of years, some of the things that keep coming up are this issue of vicarious trauma, which I mentioned before. So if you imagine you're in a newsroom somewhere, and we heard from you about the photography that you have to be in situ, we know that. But sometimes when perhaps you're on the desk and you're editing stuff, or you're watching incoming copy if you're in the Sky newsroom, or I remember being in a newsroom a long time ago, I'm going to show my age, in 2003 when they first bombed Baghdad. I was 26 years old and somebody said to me, "Hey Hannah, can you just watch the incoming news footage of Baghdad, please? And can you tell us what's safe to put out and not?" And I was 25 actually. And nobody gave me the tools then to kind of go, right, well, you need to make sure you have a break. And if something's distressing, don't kind of have the audio up, or if something's distressing, know that you can talk to somebody about this, or, make sure you don't keep watching it over and over and over again if it's recorded and held. Nobody gave me those tools. In the last year or so, particularly with the invasion of Ukraine, and I recognise there are many conflicts around the world, but particularly in newsrooms in the UK with the invasion around Ukraine, there's been a kind of rise in vicarious trauma. And your point about isolation is a really good one, because a really important one rather. During COVID, a lot of us have had to take on board different working conditions. A lot of us have been working from home or working in hybrid settings. So the kind of community that we had around us to be able to turn when you see something awful or graphic or distressing on screen and go to someone and go, "I've just seen this thing." We don't have that. We're isolated. We don't have that as much as we did. We're often working perhaps on laptops now, maybe in our bedroom, or maybe in a room where somebody else in our house might come in. I've got 2 kids, and there are numerous times where I've been seeing something and one of the kids is running and I'm like, laptop cover quickly down, because it's not appropriate for them to see that. So vicarious trauma is a major issue for journalism. I spoke with a very good friend of mine who is a editor in kind of in one of the big news organisations in the UK, not the senior editor, but one of the editors. And they said to me that their senior editor did not see vicarious trauma as an issue. That Ukraine, they said to them, well, people are dying in Ukraine and reporters are, in the thick of it, and physically it's really awful. Therefore, vicarious trauma doesn't matter. So you just kind of get on with the fact that you're saying all this awful stuff. And it's not like that doesn't, just because you've got one thing, it doesn't mean that the other thing doesn't exist, right? It's like comparing apples and oranges. My experience of trauma doesn't invalidate your experience of trauma. So you experiencing vicarious trauma doesn't mean that that person in the war zone isn't experiencing trauma. It's valid, and I think it's super important that we recognise that. Moral injury is something which is very complicated often to define. I was really fortunate to work with a chap called Professor Anthony Feinstein, who's done huge amounts of work researching the impact of journalists' work on their mental health. And we wrote a piece for the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism about moral injury. It was actually back in 2015 when the refugee crisis, when hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people came to Europe. And we realised that actually it was this unprecedented news story back then, and loads of journalists were going to cover it, and they weren't physically in difficulty or in danger. But actually, psychologically, they were finding it... Sorry, I'm walking around too much as well. Psychologically, they were coming back from covering these stories, and they were really struggling. And so we started doing a bit of research into this, and we realised that there's this thing called moral injury, which, stems back many, many years. And it was first kind of thought about in connection with the military. But this was the first time it really been looked at with the journalists. And what it basically is when we witness, perpetrate, or fail to prevent something which transgresses our ethical code. That's kind of complicated. But effectively what it means is if you imagine, so my friend Will, who is a Greek journalist, a photojournalist, who covered the refugee crisis in Lesbos. And he is the first person on the beach, and there's a boat sinking. And he's got his camera. What does he do? Right? So as a human being, your natural inclination probably is drop your camera, run and try and do something. There's no first responders there. There's no Greek Red Cross there. There's nobody but Will. Okay? And Will explains to me that, that's what he had to deal with. He saw things that were like, what the hell do I do as a journalist? What is my ethical kind of obligation? Then what do I do afterwards? Do I make, so I think moral injury from the refugees crisis we began the conversation around that in journalism. We've seen that during the COVID pandemic significantly. We've seen stories impacting people where people feel like things have happened that just aren't right. We've seen moral injury significantly in the NHS. And one of the things I would say around moral injury, it's not a mental health condition, but if left undealt with, it can be a harbinger of PTSD. A trigger, exactly. So if you don't get the support that you need from your managers and your manager hasn't got your back, I'll give you another example. When I was in Haiti after the earthquake, I went to this little town called Petit Gouave. It was near the epicenter of the earthquake. And I'd lived in Haiti previously to that. So that was part of the issues with why my trauma was so much more perhaps significant than other people. My reaction to the trauma was that much more significant. I had a little girl, I've still got a little girl, she's a bit bigger now, but my little girl was 3 at the time, and I went up into the hilltops, and I saw this little girl who had been orphaned, and she was a little bit older than my daughter, and I could still completely picture her, and she wanted water, and so I gave her my water, and as I reached into my pocket for my water, I pulled out this water bottle to give to her, a little tiny Playmobil figure, like the little Lego figures or Playmobil figures, fell out of my pocket because I'd been wearing the same clothes the week before with my daughter. And there's this moment for me where my worlds collided, and that sense of me not being able to do anything more, me failing to kind of prevent her pain and her upset and her emotion and I just wanted to scoop this little person up in my arms and hug her. Now you can't do that as a journalist. You can't do that as a journalist. And when I went back to my newsroom, on the way back, I was separated from my team. And as we know, community is super important in repairing and supporting and protecting us. And I then became physically sick when I got back and wasn't able to reintegrate into the newsroom as quickly as I'd hoped. So that was moral injury for me. I think that probably fed into some of the PTSD as well. Leona briefly mentioned online harassment. I'm just going to check the time. Excuse me. I've done a lot of work over the last few years on online harassment. In about 2012, I co-authored a book called No Woman's Land on the front lines with female, I can never remember if it's female reporters, female journalists. It was prompted by the attack on Lara Logan in Tahrir Square in Egypt, where she was sexually assaulted, and also prompted by my own experiences of sexual assault, which I hadn't spoken about at the time. But what we learned from that was that, this is back in 2012, so this is the very early days of social media interaction for journalists. But we saw a pattern developing, and over the next couple of years, we managed to get investment from a few places to do research into online harassment. And what we know is that with online harassment, certain people are more vulnerable. Women, people from the LGBTQIA plus community, people of colour, specifically more vulnerable and targeted. The same idea of people being marginalised by the news media, because this is idea of kind of, people wanting to shut us up, to silence us, right? But I think the thing with online harassment, it's become incredibly much more serious. Sorry, some of the phrases I'm using are not... It's become much more serious in the last few years. The scale of it's now impacting that many more journalists. It really is in many ways a front line for journalist safety. And as I mentioned before, with the murders of Gowrie and with the murder of Daphne, it's not something that exists virtually. But a lot of newsrooms look at it the same way as they look at vicarious trauma, and they go, it's not really that serious, is it? I mean, it's not really having an impact, is it?
Just block them.
Yeah, just block them. Don't feed the trolls. And I think that, I've been having quite a few conversations, that's probably the most diplomatic way of saying it, with news organisations saying, this is having an emotional impact on people's work, on their ability to do their jobs. It's having an impact on their mental health. It is hurting people. It is designed to shut people up. It is making people self-censor. It is forcing people from the industry. It is an issue that we need to take more seriously. I'm actually really surprised when I asked you how you were feeling today that not many more people said, I'm exhausted. Because when we do that Slido at the start of some of our other presentations, we don't do it always, we often hear that people say they're exhausted. It's been a really, really, really difficult few years, right? Personally and professionally for many people. I don't need to go into kind of the whole raft of things, but even if you were just based around here, you've had issues to do with Brexit, and you've had issues to do with the pandemic, and you've had issues to do with a lack of trust in the media, and a rise in online violence, as we say, and just so much stuff going on. So people are exhausted. Burnout is an issue too, and I think that I'm just going to take a moment to pause on burnout, because often, a little bit like with resilience, sometimes I have a bit of an issue with these two words, because it's often used as if it's the individual's issue, right? As if it's the issue of the individual to sort themselves out, right? Or be more resilient, or you're burnt out, burning the candle at both ends. But actually, burnout is a workplace phenomenon. The WHO has deemed burnout as something that means that basically your workplace is toxic, or bad, or dodgy, or unhealthy. So actually, we're seeing a lot of this. We're a lot of burnout, a lot of people who are just losing the sense of kind of faith in the work that they do, in the world. So many journalists who I speak with went into journalism because they wanted to hold power to account. They wanted to shine a light in the darkness. They wanted to, whether you want to use the phrase, give a voice to the voiceless or amplify other people's voices, or they've experienced a degree of injustice in their life, in their past, and they want to try to make a difference. It's a mission-driven job for many people. And that means that when we sense that betrayal, when we feel that loss of faith, that cuts even deeper for a lot of people. Leona mentioned before this need for holistic conversations, how safety and so how safety is kind of like split into different areas, right? So it's physical safety. So let's all go and talk about physical safety. That's one silo. Let's talk about online safety. That's another silo. Let's talk about well-being, or not mental health, but psychological safety. Very rarely call it psychological safety. But we need to integrate them, right? Because you can't have one without the other. And you can't look after somebody physically if you're not looking after somebody psychologically. But it's like pushing a boulder uphill sometimes, having conversations with newsrooms about this, how we integrate these conversations, how we make them holistic. It's going to save you money, folks, right? If you're not as siloed, it's going to save you money. So incorporating the physical, psychological, and online conversations together is really helpful. We can all learn from each other. I give people an example sometimes, and you talked before about putting on this emotional vest, Leona. There's Sian Williams, who's a broadcaster, and she's Dr. Sian Williams now from her mental health qualifications in the UK. She often talks about this emotional flak jacket. Both she and I talk about that. You go into a war zone, Josh, and you have your flak jacket, you have your PPE, you have your body armour, right? And you know that probably you're going to be okay. Very few of us have the skills and the training and the equipment to be able to allow us to don an emotional flak jacket. The preparation, the conversations, the risk assessments. It's just as important, I think, to have those conversations around mental health and well-being from a preparation perspective beforehand, and then during, and then after. A lot of the times when I'm speaking with folks, they're saying, what would have helped is having a debriefing after I've been in a story. Not just a debriefing physically from something that is really difficult from a safety perspective, but having a debriefing from an emotional safety perspective. People don't often have the tools or feel like they don't have the tools to do that. But a lot of it comes down to, what went well? What went less well? What would you do differently next time? How are you? How are you really? It's simple human conversations with people about things. So I like my plays on words and languages and acronyms and all these things. But so for me, certain things are protective, and these are the 4 C's. We mentioned before about connections. We mentioned about that sense of isolation we feel a lot of the time. When you've got something from a mental health condition, when I had PTSD, I felt like I was the only person in the world who had PTSD. Of course, I'm not the only person in the world who's got PTSD or had PTSD. I felt very, very isolated. But to being able to connect with people, and I connected with other journalists, a couple of other journalists who'd had PTSD, was just extraordinary. Some news organisations have formal peer networks. Some of them have informal peer networks. A lot of us have those informal networks where historically perhaps we've gone to the pub, might not be as helpful, but it's also been a really good way of just having that peer-to-peer, I speak your language. Because how often do we have conversations outside of journalism where you're like, that person hasn't got a clue what I'm talking about. They just don't speak my language. How often do we, seek out therapists? And I hear this a lot, where the therapist's like, oh, Haiti, that's in the Caribbean, isn't it? That must have been nice, which was my experience. I'm like, Haiti and the Caribbean's not all nice, and how was it? And I mean, come on, really. So the peer support and the people we trust is super important, and that's not always people back at home, because it can be really hard to have conversations with loved ones around this as well. It's people we trust in the newsroom or within our news community. Having conversations, spaces to speak is super important too. And again, it's not always open to everybody. People won't always feel ready to talk. People won't always feel that they've got the, strength, in inverted commas, at that stage to talk. It took me many, many years to speak about my mental health and my PTSD. But creating conversations, and I facilitate, as I've said, a lot of conversations with folks where we don't have managers in the room, and we just talk about what are some of the things that you're finding challenging. It's extraordinary because sometimes it's like hearing yourself speak. Sometimes we kind of find solutions that people are like, well, I've tried this, have you tried that? And it's like having pieces of a jigsaw. So it's really, really important. Anthony Feinstein, who's not my therapist, but is a dear friend now, will always remind me, Hannah, can you control it? And it's just a really good reminder, I think, that, if we can't control things, then there's not a great deal of point in getting worked up about them, to be honest. And it can actually take quite a lot for us to get to that point where we're like, I can't control it, I can't do anything about it. Control and influence are different, right? So sometimes we can influence things and people as well. But I think often I'll be like, can I control this? And I've had conversations with you, James, about this, right? It's like, he's just like, step back, can you control it? And no, I can't control it. And actually recognizing that you don't have control over something can sometimes be quite liberating. Coping, it's not up to us to fix everything, right? So we need to understand what are our own individual coping mechanisms, and they'll be different for everybody else. And what are the support and coping mechanisms we can borrow and gain from other people as well. So that may be within the newsroom, that might be within our networks of support if we're a freelancer, there might be other things that we've learned from others as well. But I think critically, it's super important to know when and how to ask for help. And that means help from managers. One of the points somebody made before is, who do I ask? It's kind of really up to the newsroom to kind of to show people, communicate effectively and efficiently, who are the people you need to touch base with. But also, more importantly, I think in some ways, is we should get to a situation where it's always okay to ask for help, but it's also always really important to know what the emergency numbers are if you really, really need them. Because I've had moments where I've had to call numbers that I never thought I would ever have to call because I've been very, very poorly and thinking about suicide, for instance. And so kind of knowing when and where to ask for help is super duper important. And if you're in a newsroom supporting somebody else as well, knowing where to direct that person and signpost that person is super important too. We have a brilliant designer called Mary who creates wonderful little images like this of me in my plant watering the soil. I love the fact that in English, mental health begins with the two letters M-E, me, because often we forget the me in mental health, right? Often we forget this idea that, we need to look after ourselves. We need to put on our own oxygen mask as you're told on the plane. You can't help anybody else out there if you're not helping yourself. And I think in this vast rush in journalism, in this kind of the toxicity and the speed and the journalism and all this stuff, we often forget us. And this is, I think, really important for managers as well. If you imagine the, a fruit bowl. If you've got a fruit bowl and you've got, my kids eat satsumas one week and then the next week they don't eat satsumas. So we'll have a manky satsuma in the fruit bowl. And that satsuma will pretty soon make everything else in the fruit bowl manky, right? So if you're a manky satsuma as a manager or anybody in the newsroom, chances are that if you're not looking after yourself, you're going to make other people manky, right? Really technical there. But I think that, so that's my point about walking the walk and talking the talk. So we see a lot of people talking the talk. Okay, we see a lot of people who don't even talk the talk, but we see a lot of people talking the talk, and it's actually just lip service. And there's a lot of people paying lip service to situations in mental health. But when you see somebody talking the talk and actually walking the walk, there's a news manager I know at a big news organisation who went skiing with their children and basically delegated responsibility for an entire week to somebody else, and nothing fell apart. There was a big news story in that time. Nothing fell apart. That person shone an example and gave an example to other people around them that it's fine to switch off and take a step back. That is super important. Super duper important. It's okay to have crappy days too, right? I think it's kind of giving ourselves permission to kind of go, it's a crappy day. There's a wonderful woman called Kathy English, based in Canada. And I was talking to her a while ago and I'm like, well, what are kind of one of the things that you say to your team? And she said, sometimes we have lower expectations days. Sometimes we have days where we're like, today's just not going to be one of those days where we're all firing on all cylinders, is it? And I'm like, actually, you know what? It's quite a good thing to say. And back to that point I said at the start when I was kind of sweaty palmed, taking time to notice how you are responding to things, how you are behaving, how maybe you're speaking more quickly, or maybe you are sweaty palmed, or maybe you're a bit distracted. Taking time to notice if it's not your normal, and we all have different normals, is really, really important. I am nearly finished, I promise. This again, you know, I remember some news editor at a very large news organisation saying to me, God, Hannah, are you literally going to teach people who are going to war zones in hot conditions to take bottles of water with them or to wear decent shoes? And I'm like, I am actually going to remind people who are going into war zones or civil unrest situations to wear decent shoes and to take some water with them. He's like, but it's so obvious. I'm like, yeah, well, not everybody's doing it, mate. Not everybody's doing it. So in terms of self-care tips, this is me. It's just not me. I can't do yoga at all. I'm so unbendy, it's not even funny. Exercise, rest and sleep. Sleep is the barometer of mental health, Anthony tells me, and I believe him. How often do you feel if you have a decent night's sleep that actually, okay, I'm better, I can do this, I can face the day, as opposed to if you have a really bad night's sleep, it's just like everything falls apart, right? You can't concentrate and you can't string a sentence together. But so rest and sleep, super important. Exercise, whatever fills your boots. James and I both run. Running has been really great for me for my mental health. Sometimes I get obsessive about it. Then I have to recognise that my mental health's not doing so well. Josh goes at mountains and does things like that. So we've all got different things we do. Leona does yoga. That is Leona, actually. But also eating and drinking healthily, right? A lot of the time, if I'm not feeling so well, I will reach for something that's a bit not good for me, like too much alcohol, too much sugar. Again, being mindful of that, eating and drinking enough, and eating and drinking enough of the right stuff. And breathing, which sounds really obvious, right? Don't forget to breathe. But actually proper breathing, proper the in and the out and the holding it breathing, and proper remembering to breathe, proper deep breathing. Sometimes it feels like we don't actually take time to breathe. And I think that, again, you know, sorry to the news editor for teaching you really basic stuff, but I think we need to be reminded of it. I write as well as journalism. I've written a book of short stories. That's my other thing. If you were to imagine your bio or your epitaph, if you had a gravestone after you'd passed away, would your epitaph be journalist? Full stop. Or would it be something else? Would it be, you know, this person was interested in doing this and this person did this? And yes, we don't define ourselves by our activities, but I think it's super important that we have something else that we can do outside of journalism. And it can be meditation, it can be mindfulness, it can be exercise, it can be John, my business partner, supports QPR. Poor John. But he takes his kids to go and watch QPR play football. And so, you know, having something else that's different is really, really important. And again, you know, sometimes doing something creative can be super beneficial to your mental health too. So just as a in conclusion, and I'm going to open up to questions or comments, or you can tell me that this is all a pile of absolute nonsense and you've never heard anything worse in your life, and that's fine as well. In conclusion, for me, 5 P's. People, back to that connection, social and peer support. Purpose, which we haven't really touched on, but one of the things that's really protective to our mental health is reminding ourselves of why we do this. Validation. As a manager, you saying to Leona, that was a grand job you did today, well done, thank you, I really appreciate what you did. I mean, again, that took me, 6 seconds? Very rarely hear that, do we? That sense of purpose in our work, it can be protective to support us against things like moral injury, and just recognition. Taking time to pause. Since COVID, we haven't really had the kind of moments of spontaneity that we might have had in the newsrooms in the past, those water cooler moments that perhaps we call them, where we bump into somebody at the water cooler and we're able to have a chat. In the past, maybe we had a meeting in room 1A and that finished at 5:02, and then we had 2 or 3 minutes to walk to room 2B. We don't have that now. We have no space at all. It's bam, 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 bam. Everybody's overrunning, everybody's overrun, everybody's knackered, no space. I block out a time in my calendar, meeting with Hannah. I literally do that 2 or 3 times a week, and it gives me time to just pause, and it gives me time to kind of figure out, I don't do anything sometimes, it gives me time to breathe during the day. recognizing again that if I'm owning my own calendar, it's easier. A lot of the time we don't all own our own calendars. Protected time as well, super important. How many of you have felt like your lives between your personal lives and professional lives are blurred in the last few years? It's all kind of like just becomes it all becomes amorphous, doesn't it? And so we don't have that protected time to do the things and be with the people that we need to be with. And that's really, really important as well. And I mean, I don't know about you, but this is literally an extra limb for many of us, okay? And so, I mean, I've heard Bings as well today, you know, and notifications are popping up. Oh my God. And this does things to your brain and you start getting really excited. It's like, oh my God, oh, somebody likes what I put on Twitter, yay. But also, like, we can limit the platforms on here. So we can create what Mark Cabra, who runs an organisation called the Self-Investigation, calls friction. So we create friction, so it's harder for us to kind of go and check our tweets, etc., etc. But when we're in meetings as well, you know, we've got Slack and we've got Signal and we've got Telegram and we've got WhatsApp and we've got Google Meet and we've got, you know, Microsoft Teams and we've got Zoom and we've got, God almighty, the list is endless, right? We're meeting on so many platforms. If we have ownership over it, it can be quite helpful for us to limit the platforms as well. And also sometimes, heaven forbid, some people have non-meetings days, non-Zoom meeting days, which I think can be a good thing, right? I'm going to invite you now to do, this is pretty much a final thing. This is going to take you to the wonky QR code again, but it will take you to that Q&A section. I would like to invite you to share with me, so I can share with you, one new thing you would like to practice yourself for your own mental health, or if you're in that authority position, to bring into your newsroom as well. Let's see. And if anybody likes this interactivity, I strongly recommend Slido, because it takes a bit of getting used to. As you can see, I've not quite got used to it, but it's a really great anonymous tool for interactivity, particularly when you're talking about things to do with mental health. Okay, let's see where you are. Hoping people are writing, because I can't see anything at the moment.
Very long answers.
Yes, go to the bottom. Thank you. Aha, excellent. Great. Practice more sports, e.g. running or football. Normalise conversation about mental health. A green room where journalists can switch off. Excellent. Looking after myself. Can't pour from an empty cup. You cannot pour from an empty cup, no. Declare it's okay not to be okay. Yay. Building a network of like-minded people across the industry. There is one. Please join it. Please come and collaborate. We cannot do this by ourselves. We cannot afford to be in competition with each other. There are too many people out there who with too many needs that we can't do this alone. It's really, really important. A chill space. So there's various chill spaces coming up. A safe room in newsrooms where people can go when they feel like they might take an anxiety attack, etc. Yeah, and I think also having those signposts in place in those rooms for if people need more help, super important. Nearly there. Oh, hang on. It's just deleted itself. You get the picture. Nearly there. Hang on. And, yeah, okay, we've got looking after ourselves. Thank you so much. I think that we're there, pretty much. Just as my final, my 6 R's. Recognising how we feel, putting some resistance in place, so kind of controlling what we can control, creating boundaries and giving ourselves permission to make those boundaries. Rest and recovery, a reminder of why we're doing this, and a realisation we are all human. Journalists are journalism's most precious resource. Despite what they tell you about AI, journalists are journalism's most precious resource. Thank you for your time, for your interaction.